Well, over the last 20 years, a total we've worked out of some £32 million has been paid in compensation in a total of over 6,600 cases. They cover an enormous range, a huge disparity, both in the harm suffered and also in amounts paid out. They range from one case of $750, which was paid to a child wounded in the face in Afghanistan back in 2010, through to the settlement of over £2.8 million, which was paid to the families of 9 Iraqis for violations of the prohibition on torture and violations of the right to life. So there is an enormous disparity. The disparity cannot really be explained by the nature of the harm caused, or necessarily by the role of UK forces. There have been 14 prosecutions over those 20 years, and that compares to, as I said, the over 6,600 cases of successful compensation awards. So you can immediately see that, certainly in terms of delivering some form of justice to civilians harmed on the ground, civil claims against the Ministry of Defence, not against individual service personnel, against the Ministry of Defence, have been much more successful than the criminal prosecutions.
We did eventually have 4 test cases go to trial. We were eventually, after having had to threaten a JR, allowed our clients to and their witnesses to come and give evidence at court. They were duly cross-examined over many days, and in all 4 cases were found to have suffered breaches of Articles 3 and 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights, as scheduled to the Human Rights Act, as well in several of the cases breaches of the Geneva Convention on prohibition against inhumane treatment. So again, these cases, as you said, were brought against a pretty toxic atmosphere, very much a lot of misinformation as well in the press, a lot of accusations that these are all spurious cases and vexatious claims. And the sort of amplification to those voices at that time is in stark contrast, I think, to the very quiet apology finally issued by Ben Wallace last month, when he did finally acknowledge that there had been some shocking and shameful incidents that occurred by British forces in Iraq. And he did apologise unreservedly to all those who had suffered unacceptable treatment at the hands of UK forces. But you know, there was barely any reporting of that. But you know, I think that's par for the course. When reading the report, and one of the key things to actually come out is that even though we engaged in some very lengthy, some very tough legal battles for compensation for that side of reparations, we did eventually get there, and as you said, in many hundreds of cases. But what I think has been far more difficult to secure for our clients are our admissions, our apologies, our you know, the recognition of the need for reform, and they are much harder to secure. And I can only think really of a couple of cases where pretty early on in litigation there were actual admissions and apologies, one of which you've touched on already and is dealt with in the report, and that's the very extreme case of Baha Mercer and the men tortured alongside him back in Basra in September 2003. And even that, I think, was almost, it may not have come to light if it hadn't been for the sheer dogged determination of Baha Musa's father. I think virtually all the other cases that we have brought, which total around 700 or so, which have resolved successfully, the vast majority have resolved without any admissions of liability. You know, a lot of the headway initially made, I think, by these really, really brave individuals to come forward, to reach out to NGOs, to reach out to journalists, not just to necessarily accept that what happened is just what happens in war, or to accept small ex gratia payments at the time without wanting more, and without wanting more of an explanation about what happened to them or their loved ones.
I understand that we have been joined by Colonel Nicholas Mercer, who I think is attending, and I was just going to ask him to say so. I hope I haven't taken him by surprise. I was just asking whether he might just join us for a moment and say a couple of words. Nicholas Mercer, the Reverend Nicholas Mercer, for those of you who don't know, was the ranking legal advisor for Operation Telic, for the UK military operation in Iraq, and had the job, therefore, of trying to ensure that the High Command and soldiers on the ground were advised as to the state of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, to try and make sure that all the rules were adhered to. And so he's in a very good position to talk about some of the challenges faced, and also about what went wrong. Are you there? Are you with us, Nicholas?
Yeah, I am, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mark, very much. Obviously, I'm not on the official list of speakers, but first of all, I'd like to suggest a title for this series of talks, which is Notes on a Scandal. It seems to me that there are two different narratives being run. The government narrative that nothing happened, that every claim is vexatious, and then these enormous number of civil claims, largely born out of abuse, and somehow the two don't seem to marry, except they do. As I said to Lord Dannatt when interviewed on Radio 4, this is an awful lot of money and an awful lot of abuse. The trouble is that the state has a narrative that it prefers. It has a narrative that it wishes to present to the British public, but the reality is remarkably different. I think the astonishing fact that after the Overseas Operations Bill had sort of spectacularly belly-flopped in the House of Commons, the government then quietly settled another 400 cases coming out of Iraq. But during the proceedings, as if butter wouldn't melt in their mouth, they would have us believe a great fiction. The battle goes on. We are by no means near the end of this. I made criminal complaints to the IHAT. Nothing happened to any of those complaints. I complained when they were branded vexatious, not individually, but generically. I said, well, my claims aren't vexatious. I'm an eyewitness to abuse in interrogation. I've seen torture firsthand. And Baroness Goldie sort of said, oh, there, I'm really sorry to hear that. It must be awful for you. And what I'd really like to hear is, don't worry, we'll do something about it.
Overall in Afghanistan, there were, needless to say, it's already been said, thousands of such incidents, some of them with multiple casualties, some one or two. Most of them, of course, weren't counted, and this is covered quite in some detail in the report and elsewhere. From my own perspective, I saw a dead baby once who had been shot in the head by an unfortunate soldier, who I've no doubt, by the way, lives with that incident to this day. I'll come back to that in a second. Not reported. A journalist friend of mine, Afghan journalist friend of mine, just on an occasional day would come in with reports for checkpoint incidents, or one particular bombing killing 28 people outside Geresh. There was another bombing in Bardoan in the north of Helmand, where there were roughly 100 casualties, also not reported. My estimate for what it's worth, and it's very low, is that we can evidence about 500, well over 500 fatal casualties inflicted by British armed forces. Very few of those, although others, were compensated, none of them adequately. I want to say, though, that if you talk to infantry soldiers on the ground in Helmand, who have been on the ground in Helmand, but very many of them will have stories such as those I've just come up with. And most of them, I've never come across a soldier who doesn't regret these. And often you do come across soldiers who will say they've never forgotten anything about it every day. And at least one case that I'm aware of, one particular casualty who's ruined a young man's life who continues to suffer from that. Many others are like that. So my point is that this isn't necessarily as a result of the cavalier and careless use of armed force, not necessarily, but it is the result, of course, of the position into which these people are led.
When there's airstrikes causing the civilian harm or deaths, it's become almost impossible, from what I've seen, for civilians to get access to compensation. A lot of the civilians who I spoke to in Mosul, who had lost relatives or had been injured or lost family members in airstrikes, had no way of determining which coalition member was the one that had bombed the place where their families had been sheltering. In particular, I'm thinking about this woman named Ruha Khader. She was one of the civilians who was trapped in the old city of Mosul by the so-called Islamic State during the operations, and her son, who was 4 years old, was killed in an airstrike. And she has no way to know which of the coalition members was responsible for it. And she's not alone in that. And I've spoken to a lot of civilians who lost family members, and almost all of them say, there's no way to know who bombed us. And also most of them at this point really don't have that much hope that they will get compensation or reparations of any sort, or even an ex gratia payment. Not that people necessarily know the exact nuances, but that they don't expect to get any sort of reparations from the states that bombed them. They, in the vast majority of instances, there's been no reach out to them, and they've just kind of been left to deal with this on their own. And when you go to Mosul, you can see that the effects of the 2017 and earlier operations are still very much with people. The city, large parts of it, are still destroyed, and of course, when you've lost a family member, there's no way to actually compensate that. It's a long term horrific harm.
I was really interested by what you said. The response you got from the Ministry of Defence. I wonder whether I just invite you to read that out again.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? We do not routinely capture the names of civilians killed in airstrikes or something?
We do not routinely obtain the names or details of enemy or civilian casualties on the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And also,
there's something about that word routinely, which kind of strikes me as telling us a little bit more than maybe was intended.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, another thing that I feel like is important is that they used to have an investigative team that would go to Iraq and investigate incidents, but they've shut that down. And there's been no talk, as far as I know, of reopening it again. And they say that they only admit one civilian casualty, but given the amount of airstrikes that they performed, that doesn't really make any sense, given that we know how many civilians died in coalition airstrikes. But the fact that they don't investigate it kind of gives them a shield to hide behind.
combined operations in Syria and Iraq for the Royal Air Force have now numbered over 1,700 separate airstrikes. From those airstrikes, the Ministry of Defense claims that over 4,000 ISIS fighters have been killed, over 4,000, and they have accepted that there was one civilian casualty. Now, anyone who's familiar with the circumstances of the battles of Raqqa or Mosul or Baghouz listens to those statistics and thinks there is something very, very wrong there. And it seems to me the only way you can come up with a statistic like that is to have such a wide definition of who is potentially a fighter, or such a sort of, lack of interest about investigating the status of who was killed afterwards, that you can simply deny all the possible civilian casualties.
Basim Razzo and his family lived in Mosul, in the outskirts of Mosul, and it was also in the year of 2015, September 2021. Around midnight, he went to bed. His wife had already gone to bed, his daughter too, and the next thing he saw was a clear sky above his head. The roof had disappeared. His wife was dead next to him in bed. His daughter was killed. His brother and his son were killed in the villa next to his. The next day, the coalition published a video saying that it had destroyed an IS facility near Mosul, and the video showed the bombing of Razzo's house and his brother's house. Now, the coalition was unlucky that Mr. Razzo was well connected to the United States. He had lived and worked there for years, and so he took his case to the United States, and it took a while, but then the US recognized that a mistake had been made, and he was offered $15,000 in reparation. He refused, as the amount was far too low given his losses, and the case came to a standstill. What happened then was that a Dutch pilot said in an interview that he had been involved in the bombing of an object that later turned out to be a civilian object, without naming anything more specific than this. And the US had acknowledged that it was a mistake to bomb Mr. Razzo's house, but it had not given any details on who had flown the airplane. But Basim Razzo had by then already appeared in the New York Times, and the Dutch journalist linked the story of the Dutch pilot and the story of Basim Razzo and concluded that this must be one and the same story. And it was admitted he was right. The Dutch pilot appeared on television anonymously saying how bad he felt about what happened, but that he had done nothing else than implementing the instructions that he caught, and that the object that he bombed was the object identified by the US as an IS object. Basim Razzo's US lawyer handed his case over to me, and to make a long story short, we had a meeting at the Ministry of Defense, and Razzo was compensated for his damages in full. Publicly, our ministry declared that they paid out of humanitarian concerns, but that was very apparent in trying to prevent setting a precedent, I concluded. But while the coalition refers to itself as a coalition, it's not a legal entity, so it may be able to take responsibility for bombings factually, but not legally. So in order to hold someone actually accountable, you have to break down the coalition into individual states. They do bear responsibility. But at the same time, the coalition is organized in a way that factually all states participating in the coalition are interconnected. When we addressed the coalition in an effort to find out the responsible state, the answer was, and I quote, we do not categorize strikes by nation. There's no single nation involved in a strike process, which includes intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, and planning before the actual strike is conducted. All strikes are conducted by the coalition. So that was a very interesting response that we got. Legally, the coalition doesn't exist, but factually, it's only the coalition that acts. And it leaves the victims empty-handed. They fall between stools and they cannot address anyone because everyone is responsible, meaning that no one is responsible. You wonder why individual states will want to cover up who conduct these strikes, why to add to such destruction by not making known which state conducts the strikes and which states are factually responsible, so you can figure out the legal responsibility. I feel it's immoral, it's unnecessary, and it's not so much for actual payments that people are looking for, but it's really for truth finding in order for them to piece their lives together again.
This Kafkaesque idea that the coalition has no legal personality, the coalition doesn't exist, but that all the cases of bombings are the responsibility of the coalition, seems to me to sort of sum up just what an extraordinary situation we've got ourselves into with regard to reparations. And I started off, an hour ago saying, well, what's the what distinguishes cases where reparations are received and where they're not? And one of the answers has to be, in addition to patience and being well connected and being in the right place, just luck. It just has to be luck. So some people are lucky and many are not.
Yeah.
Whereas we all know that reparations are a right. They should be awarded. That if civilians are harmed as a result of a violation, as a result of a breach of the Geneva Conventions or human rights law, then they should receive reparation as of a right. And that's certainly the policy of ceasefire. And we believe that reparations needs to be holistic. It shouldn't just be about a monetary payment. It also needs to look at an acknowledgement of wrongdoing where there was wrongdoing, and a commitment to institutional reform where problems are systematic.
I just want to raise a couple of comparisons. British soldiers are cared for by after their injuries by the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme, which has had several iterations. But if you're blinded, as one very close friend of mine was in combat, you would expect an award, or would have expected an award, of about £570,000. An Afghan blinded, and I'm absolutely certain many will expect nothing exceeding $7,000 US. And we could go on. So we're looking at figures of compensation of between 1% and 5% of that awarded to British soldiers killed or sort of injured in accidental, negligent, or very occasionally deliberate military action.
I would just like to make one point about the holistic approach to damages for civilian casualties and damage. I am a military lawyer by background. The laws of war permit the striking of legitimate targets, and it sounds harsh, but collateral damage is permitted as part of those military operations. It is not necessarily unlawful to hit a protected target if the protected status of that target has been violated, and similarly to hit a target which causes collateral damage. I think we need to bear that in mind, that not all damage is unlawful. But at the same time, it would be nice to see a holistic approach to this as to in what circumstances the government is prepared to compensate people for injuries occasioned by the state, either as a direct result of military operations and more particularly once the person or individual has been reduced to capture or has been detained by the state.
So reparation needs to be holistic, but it also needs effectively to deal with the scale of the problem that presents itself. In UK military operations, we have seen civilian harm on a very significant scale, and that requires some kind of concerted institutional response to deal with the number of claims that may come in, both in current operations and in any future operations.